August 24, 1944. Midnight. Under the Pont Neuf, the oldest bridge in Paris, a German engineer kneels in the dark, checking wires by torchlight. He moves to the next pillar. Then the next. All along the Seine, in the vaults beneath Notre Dame, inside the iron legs of the Eiffel Tower, in the tunnels under the Louvre, German demolition teams are doing the same thing. Wiring. Checking. Waiting. Above them, in a suite at the Hotel Meurice, sits the man with the authority to give one final order. His name is Dietrich von Choltitz. He is the military governor of Paris. And in his coat pocket is a direct command from Adolf Hitler himself: when the Allies arrive, Paris does not get liberated. It gets destroyed. Every bridge. Every monument. Every factory, train station, and telephone exchange. Hitler's exact words, relayed through his high command, left no room for interpretation. The city was to be reduced to what he called a field of ruins. Von Choltitz had the men. He had the explosives. He had a direct line to Berlin, and a Führer who was becoming more unstable and more furious by the hour as the war collapsed around him. By every measure of military obedience, the same obedience that had defined this officer's entire career, Paris should have burned to the ground on August 25, 1944. It didn't. And the reason why is one of the strangest, most contested stories to come out of the entire Second World War, not a clean tale of heroism, but a tangled knot of ego, self-preservation, secret negotiations, and a ticking clock that came down to a matter of hours. Was Dietrich von Choltitz a hero who saved one of the most beautiful cities on earth? Or a man simply trying to save his own neck, dressed up afterward in the language of conscience? By the end of this video, you'll have the facts to decide for yourself. Because this isn't a simple story, and that's exactly what makes it worth telling, right? To understand why Paris survived, you first have to understand who Dietrich von Choltitz actually was, and it is not who you'd expect from a man later celebrated as the savior of Paris. Born in 1894 into a Prussian military family, von Choltitz was essentially raised for the officer corps. Military service wasn't a career choice for a family like his, it was an inheritance. He fought in the First World War, stayed in the army through the lean interwar years under the Treaty of Versailles restrictions, and by the time the Second World War began, he was a career soldier fully fused to the machine of German military obedience. And that obedience had a body count. In 1940, during the invasion of the Netherlands, von Choltitz commanded a battalion involved in the bombing of Rotterdam, an attack that killed hundreds of civilians and destroyed much of the historic city center, carried out even as surrender negotiations were already underway. It remains one of the most notorious bombings of the early war in Western Europe. Then came the Eastern Front. Von Choltitz commanded troops during the brutal siege of Sevastopol in 1942, a campaign marked by massive destruction and civilian suffering. He was, by every account, a highly effective, highly obedient officer, the kind of commander who executed orders without hesitation, who didn't ask questions, who got results. This is the man Hitler chose, in August 1944, to be the last military governor of Paris. And Hitler chose him for exactly that reason. He needed someone who wouldn't flinch. He picked the wrong man for that job, or perhaps, more accurately, he picked a man who had finally run out of road. By the summer of 1944, Germany's position in France was disintegrating. The Allies had broken out of Normandy in late July. Paris, occupied since June 1940, was no longer a safe-regard city. It was becoming a front line. Hitler was gripped by paranoia and fury in equal measure. He remembered 1940, when Paris fell to Germany largely untouched, an open city surrendered without a fight. Now the tables had turned, and he could not stomach the symbolism of losing it back without consequence. If Germany could not hold Paris, he decided, then the Allies would inherit nothing but rubble. Von Choltitz arrived in Paris on August 7, 1944, taking command with orders that were unambiguous: fortify the city, prepare demolition charges on its bridges and landmarks, and be ready to reduce Paris to ruins on Hitler's signal rather than surrender it intact. German engineers had already begun the preparatory work, placing explosives on the Seine bridges, in key infrastructure, and reportedly around landmarks including the Eiffel Tower. Meanwhile, the city itself was becoming impossible to control. Resistance fighters within Paris, the French forces of the interior, were growing bolder by the day, staging strikes and skirmishes even before Allied troops were anywhere near the city. On August 19, a full-scale uprising broke out. Police officers seized the prefecture. Barricades went up across the city. Small arms fire echoed through neighborhoods that had been quiet under occupation for 4 years. Von Choltitz now had a garrison of roughly 20,000 troops, an increasingly hostile population, an approaching Allied army, and a direct order sitting on his desk that demanded the total destruction of the city he was standing in. He had, by his own later account, days, maybe hours, to decide what kind of officer he was going to be at the end of a war that everyone in the room already knew was lost. This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because von Choltitz didn't have some solitary crisis of conscience in a locked room. He was pulled toward restraint through a series of back-channel negotiations most viewers have never heard of. The key figure here is Raoul Nordling, the Swedish consul general in Paris. Nordling was not a soldier or a spy, he was a diplomat, using his neutral status to broker informal arrangements between the German command and the various French factions inside the city. Over several tense meetings, Nordling pushed von Choltitz toward moderation, releasing political prisoners, agreeing to informal ceasefires with the resistance, buying time. What exactly was in von Choltitz's mind during these meetings has been debated for decades, and this is worth being honest about. His own post-war account, told in interviews and later in his memoirs, paints a picture of a man wrestling with conscience, unwilling to become the officer remembered for erasing Paris from the map, especially with Germany's defeat now inevitable. In this version, he found something in himself that Rotterdam and Sevastopol hadn't required, a line he wasn't willing to cross. But historians have pushed back on this framing for good reason. By August 1944, following the order to destroy Paris carried real risk for von Choltitz personally. The Allies were closing in. Being remembered as the man who leveled one of the world's great cities in a war Germany had already lost was not just morally ugly, it was a fast route to a war crimes tribunal. Stalling, negotiating, and ultimately surrendering rather than demolishing gave him a far better outcome, both for his own survival and his reputation, than pressing the detonator ever could. The honest answer is probably, both things were true at once. Von Choltitz was almost certainly calculating his own position. He was also, by multiple contemporary accounts, increasingly disturbed by the prospect of what total demolition would actually mean, and aware that the military logic behind it was hollow. Destroying Paris would not save Germany. It would not slow the Allied advance in any meaningful way. It would accomplish nothing except Hitler's need for vengeance against a city that had embarrassed him by surviving. Whatever the exact mixture of motives, the practical result was the same. The detonators stayed quiet, day after day, while Hitler screamed for action from Berlin. While von Choltitz stalled in the Hotel Muris, outside the city a different countdown was running. General Philippe Leclerc commanded the 2nd French Armored Division, attached to the American army but pushing hard, with tacit Allied blessing, to be the force that liberated Paris. This mattered enormously, symbolically and politically. After 4 years of occupation, France needed to be seen liberating its own capital, not simply receiving it from American or British hands. Leclerc's division raced toward the city through the final days of August, brushing aside pockets of German resistance. Inside Paris, the uprising was intensifying and casualties were mounting on both sides. Von Choltitz was now holding a shrinking, increasingly encircled position, still technically bound by Hitler's demolition order, still fielding furious demands from Berlin to act. On August 24, in the evening, the first Free French tanks, a small vanguard sent ahead by Leclerc specifically to reach the city before nightfall, rolled into Paris and reached the Hôtel de Ville. Church bells across the city began to ring, spreading the news through the streets before the main force had even arrived. The following morning, August 25, the bulk of Leclerc's division entered Paris in force. Von Choltitz's position was now hopeless in every sense, militarily, strategically, and personally. He had not detonated the charges. He had not carried out Hitler's order. What remained was the final act, how the end would actually happen. On the afternoon of August 25, 1944, French troops reached the Hôtel Muris, von Choltitz's headquarters on the Rue de Rivoli. there was a brief exchange of fire in the lobby before German troops inside laid down their weapons. Von Choltitz was found in his office and taken into custody. He was brought to the prefecture of police, where he formally signed the surrender of the German garrison in Paris, surrendering the city not to the demolition Hitler had demanded, but intact, its bridges standing, its monuments untouched, its streets already filling with cheering crowds. Later that same day, Charles de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées in a triumphant procession through a city that, by any reasonable military logic 4 days earlier, should have been in ruins. Hitler, informed of the surrender, reportedly flew into a rage, demanding to know why his order hadn't been carried out. It never would be. Paris had survived, spared not by an Allied rescue that arrived in the nick of time to disarm bombs, but by the simple fact that the man with his hand on the detonator never gave the final signal. In the decades after the war, Dietrich von Choltitz leaned hard into the narrative of himself as Paris's reluctant savior. He gave interviews. He wrote memoirs. He was, by several accounts, happy to accept the label of the man who defied Hitler out of love for a great city. Paris itself, notably, never fully embraced him as a hero, and that ambivalence is telling. This was, after all, a man responsible for Rotterdam. A man who had followed brutal orders without hesitation for most of his career, right up until the moment obedience stopped serving his own interests. The uncomfortable truth many historians point to is that von Choltitz didn't defy the order because he'd suddenly discovered a moral center, he defied it because, by August 1944, defiance was the safer bet. And maybe that's actually the more interesting story than a clean tale of last-minute redemption. Not a hero in a Hollywood sense, but a man at the exact hinge point of a collapsing regime, doing the math on his own survival, and happening to land, this one time, on the side of preservation rather than destruction. Paris stands today, its bridges, its towers, its skyline, in part because one exhausted, self-interested, morally compromised officer decided that 4 years of following orders had earned him nothing, and that this order, of all of them, wasn't worth carrying out. Whether you call that heroism or simply survival dressed up as principle, the city is still standing. And in the end, that's the part history actually remembers.